Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So let's look at the outcome of the Hoguk maneuvers staged by the ROK, South Korean military establishment in this very ragged, sort of chaotic border area, the Western Islands, the Yellow Sea coast of Korea. This was a crisis obviously planned, provoked in advance. If you had the same kind of a result in 1999, 2002, and then again a year ago, November 2009, if you're going to have these maneuvers, and above all, if you're going to have live fire exercises in a disputed border area where the North Koreans, the DPRK, claim that this belongs to them, we see the communique that the DPRK just issued in the last couple of days. They say, it's our established practice that when somebody shoots into our territory, what we consider our territory, we shoot back at them. So that's our long-standing way of administering a decisive rebuff to these imperialist aggressors and so forth. So turns out that the crisis starts on Tuesday, but it's long planned. It's a set piece. We're at the Yeonpyeong Island area, and the Hoguk maneuver is about to begin. So the North Korean government faxes a warning to the South Korean government, don't carry out live fire exercises in this territory, which we claim as our sovereign territory. Don't shoot your weapons onto our sovereign territory. It's similar. You could imagine if you think of the German border during the Cold War, the wall around Berlin. The military exercises were generally not held in immediate propinquity to this sensitive border. Right? They'd be held, someplace a little bit further back. So on Tuesday morning, the South Korean guns fired first, in effect, right, and bombarded what the North Koreans say is their territory. The North Koreans send a fax to South Korea saying, is this an attack? Are you attacking us? Please clarify, is this a war? And at that point, we're dealing, of course, with President Lee Myung-bak of South Korea, a reactionary warmonger. He's the result of two presidencies in South Korea, which were attempting to establish a line of reconciliation and ultimate unification with North Korea, which, of course, the neocons in Washington under the Bush regime could not stand this idea that the South Korean president was essentially not sharing in their Cold War dreams of revival. So they got rid of those two, and now we have President Lee, who is this reactionary figure who is willing to go along with all of these things. Notice also, in the wake of that G20 in Seoul, South Korea last week, the U.S. is actually happy to change the subject, and no longer the issue of hot money. The issue had been whether helicopter Ben Bernanke's QE2, quantitative easing, and the $600 billion of hot money, whether that money was going to flow to a large degree into South Korea, drive up the currency, and ruin the country's export economy. They get that off the topic, right? Get that off the agenda. And don't talk about the abject failure of the U.S. to line up anybody against China. Now, what you have is the classic gambit that the U.S. can provoke a crisis involving North Korea, right? North Korea is obviously very easily provoked. They're very easily manipulable. And with that, once you get a crisis, the impact of that on Japan and on South Korea is to drive them under the protective umbrella of the U.S., to increase their obedience and their subservience and subordination to the U.S. because of their strategic need vis-a-vis this problem, what if North Korea attacks us? Now, a couple of things that make this an extraordinary crisis in some ways. The first is the North Korean succession. Right? We've got this essentially a hereditary communist state, I guess, with Kim Il-sung being able to transfer the leadership during the 1980s to Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-il attempting to maintain the rule of the House of Kim over Korea by transferring the baton of leadership to his son, Kim Kim Jong-un. And the problem with this is this going to be a smooth transition, or will there be political frictions? And the political frictions you have to look for are in the North Korean military. Are there senior generals, right, people who have been fighting the imperialists for a long time, who don't like the idea of a young young man educated in the private schools of Switzerland, having lived a life of relative, certainly significant ease and cosmopolitan enjoyment there in Europe? Is he the suitable warrior leader for a garrison state of the type of North Korea? And maybe some people in the North Korean military, a camarilla of generals, who might say, no, this is not an acceptable transition. We don't want the House of Kim. We want some kind of Bonapartist military government. So what this means is that when the U.S. and South Korea provoke North Korea, as with the Hoguk maneuver, and it's all out there in public, right? The North Koreans say we were provoked. What does this lead to? This regime is always jumpy. They're always very sensitive. They're always extremely alert to any possible slight, real or imagined, right? Anything that violates their notions of national honor, gets them going. Right now, they're in a state of extreme heightened sensitivity, because the last thing that a new leader would want, as he attempts to consolidate some power inside the state apparatus of North Korea, is to be seen as a weakling. So that's always there. But remember, none of this would have happened if it weren't for Hoguk. In other words, it's not a case that Kim Jong-un went looking for an occasion. The occasion was dished up to him on a silver platter by South Korea and the U.S. So therefore, I think one of the main demands is stop these provocative military exercises. We know from our discussions of 9/11 that it's generally good not to have so many military drills and exercises, and above all, don't have them be realistic drills susceptible of being flipped live in very sensitive areas, because the results can be quite tragic. Now, the other thing that's going on in the background is the U.S.-Chinese tensions, right? We had this missile launch, this trail of missile exhaust and contrail over the Pacific Ocean, probably 35 miles west of Los Angeles, north of the Santa Catalina Island, in international waters. Now, there are two competing stories on this. One story comes from Robert Ellsworth, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, who was interviewed on KCBS television, I believe, in the Los Angeles area, asked, what do you think this was? And he says, I think this was an ICBM. I would say maybe it's an SLBM, right, a submarine-launched ballistic missile. I don't know if the U.S. actually has a proper intercontinental ballistic missile that can be launched from a submarine. That's a question. I don't think that exists. Rather, I think we're talking about an SLBM, a submarine-launched ballistic missile. But Ellsworth, in any case, says, I think this is a nuclear-capable missile being launched from the Pacific coast region of the U.S. across the Pacific towards China and people there in order to remind them that the U.S. has this capability. And this was on the eve of Obama's trip. In other words, a military intimidation of China in order to give extra added emphasis to the demand of the Obama regime that China sabotage their internal economy by letting the renminbi float instead of being controlled by the sovereign apparatus of China. So that's one story. The other story in a minute.